Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Friday Law Talk with Lone Star Legal Aid. It's hosted by our Crime Victims Unit today. My name is Jocelyn Camarillo. I am a network coordinator with the Texas Crime Victim Legal Assistance Network. And before we start our discussion and I introduce my guest, I just want to read a disclaimer as a reminder to everybody that this presentation is intended to serve as legal information and does not replace legal advice. Please contact Lone Star Legal Aid at 1-800-733-8394 or go to www.lonestarlegal.org for more information on legal assistance. Also, just want to make note that Lone Star Legal Aid does not discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, gender expression, sexual orientation, age, national origin, ancestry, disability, marital status, or military status in any of its activities or operations. So basically our discussion this week is in honor of our National Crime Victims Week, which is recognized one whole week out of the month of April every year. Today, we're going to discuss important topics, sometimes hard to talk about topics, including victims' rights. April is also Child Abuse and Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So I do want to talk about these hard to talk about subjects that is important, I think, for the public to be aware and know a little bit about. And unfortunately, these types of victimizations are very prevalent and they do intersect sometimes. So in that respect, I do have the distinct privilege to have Davina here share her knowledge and expertise as an attorney in these areas. Davina, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yes, so hi, thank you so much for having me, Jocelyn. My name is Davina, and I am the Justice for Human Trafficking staff attorney here with Lone Star Legal Aid's Crime Victims Unit. I focus on helping clients with their civil legal needs in all different types of aspects: family law, it could be housing issues, tax issues, wage and theft, so employment issues, just a gamut of civil legal needs.
Awesome. Well, I'm very grateful to have you here with me today, letting us know what you do and sharing your knowledge on the topics we're going to go over here. Is it okay if I ask you a few questions and have you share your knowledge with us?
Yes, that's okay. And I actually want to thank you so much for inviting me to have the opportunity to highlight and bring awareness to crime victims' rights, child abuse, and sexual assault issues.
Awesome. Can you tell us what is National Crime Victims Week?
So every year in April, 1 week is dedicated to acknowledging National Victims' Rights Week. And this week is dedicated to raising awareness, learning about victimization and the effects of victimization on individuals, families, their friends, and communities. It's also to promote laws, policies, and programs that help victims of crime. So National Crime Victims' Rights Week highlights the import of the voices of crime survivors and the countless service providers and first responders who work to support them.
Okay. And so it's my understanding that the Department of Justice Office of Victims of Crime provides a theme for this commemorated week. What is this year's theme?
This year, the NCVRW theme is rights, access, and equity for all victims. So this year's theme underscores the importance of helping crime survivors find their justice by enforcing victims' rights, expanding access to services, and ensuring equity and inclusion for all victims.
Okay, so can you tell me why it's important for victims of crime to have rights?
Yes, so one of the most significant rights for crime victims is the right to be heard during critical criminal justice proceedings that affect the victim's interest. And this type of participation is primary. It's a primary way that victims are able to play a proactive role in the criminal justice process and have their voices heard. Okay,
and what would you say, or what is recognized as the most important right for a crime victim?
So one of the most significant rights for crime victims is the right to be heard. This is, the respect and recognition of the victims, which is part of, being in the right to be heard.
Right.
Under the access to justice and fair treatment, the United Nations Declaration states that victims should be treated with compassion and respect for their dignity. And the most fundamental need is for victims to be recognized, and the highlighting of the human dignity of a victim is a fundamental right.
Okay, thank you for that elaborate answer. What is recognized as, so you talked about the important right, what is recognized as the most basic right?
So the most basic is, first of all, for victims to be reasonably protected from the accused, especially as they may have to come before them to be able to express the right to have their voice heard.
Okay, and it's my understanding that that's something that you could help with. So in that regard, are there other legal issues that you help victims with as an attorney to be reasonably protected?
Yes, so as the Justice for Human Trafficking Survivors Program staff attorney, I support, in terms of protection, I support them, survivors, in certain ways. That's filing for name changes, which also allows them to get a new social security number, restoring identification papers such as birth certificates, and obtaining expungements and or non-disclosures for activities survivors were forced to engage in while being trafficked that then ended up in arrests or charges. So these are different ways that I'm able to help survivors retain some of their rights and move forward.
Okay, so like you said, those are some of the issues that you can help with regards to protection specifically. Are there other legal services or legal issues that you can help with beyond that?
Yes, so thankfully I'm able to help in a whole host of civil legal issues. So some of those include housing and eviction issues, labor and employment protections, tax issues, and more. Just different areas of a person's life that may be affected in many different ways that we may not think about in victimhood.
Yeah, okay. And why would you say is important for victims to have rights to access legal aid like the services you provide?
First, it alleviates some of the hurdles that victims face when attempting to stabilize their lives. And for me, as I work with survivors, it helps survivors to live securely and independently away from their perpetrators. So for example, as I spoke about some of the civil legal protections I provide, many survivors are not able to secure decent jobs or safe housing due to arrest or convictions directly linked to their instances of trafficking. So through non-disclosure or expungement or name changes, I'm able to help survivors get a somewhat clean start to be able to obtain job security, safe housing, and other rights that they should have access to.
Okay, awesome. That's very awesome. Okay, so switching gears here a little bit, I started to mention earlier about April being Child Abuse Awareness Month. So on that, I do want to touch on the subject and bring some awareness to that as well. Could you tell us, first of all, what is child abuse?
The CDC defines child abuse and neglect, which is also generally referred to as child maltreatment, as any act or a series of acts of commission or omission by a parent or other caregiver, clergy, coach, teacher, that results in harm, potential for harm, or even the threat of harm to a child.
Okay. And so in that respect, could you tell us what are the main types of child abuse?
Yes, so the World Health Organization defines child maltreatment as all forms of physical and emotional ill treatment, sexual abuse, neglect, and exploitation that results in actual or potential harm to the child's health, development, or dignity. And within that definition, we found, well, not me, but they have found 4 main types of abuse, that being neglect, physical abuse, psychological abuse, and sexual abuse. So abuse is also defined as an act of commission, while neglect is defined as an act of omission in the care leading to potential or actual harm.
Okay. So my next question is a little bit loaded, and I know that it could have multiple answers, but what are a couple of the telltale signs of child abuse?
Yes, so there's a whole host of signs. However, some of the major ones that I think are very noticeable right away are changes in behavior, where this happens because abuse can lead to, children appearing scared, anxious, depressed, aggressive, or withdrawn. And even sometimes kind of going back to childhood behaviors such as thumb sucking, bedwetting, being fearful of the dark or strangers, and in some extreme cases, even loss of acquired language or memory problems. Another major one that I think a lot of people, especially in school settings, would be able to notice is changes in school performance and attendance. Sometimes abused children have difficulty concentrating in school, or they'll have excessive absences because of whoever's abusing them may be trying to hide their injuries from authorities who can then, report that something's going on with this child. So those are some major ones that you'll probably notice right off the bat.
Okay. Thanks for sharing some of those. I know there's a plethora of them. So
Yeah.
I want to highlight a pretty scary statistic from the Children's Advocacy Center, but I think it's important for viewers to know that they have made mention that 1 in 10 children will be sexually abused before their 18th birthday. And that's a scary thought. And even scarier is the involvement of the fact that child sex trafficking exists. Right. And I know that you have a lot of knowledge in human trafficking and in that area. Can you explain what sex trafficking is?
Yes. So sex trafficking is generally, there's sex trafficking of adults and then sex trafficking of children. Sex trafficking for adults is the use of force, fraud, or coercion, specifically for the purposes of recruiting, harboring, transporting, the provision of, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of an adult for the purpose of a commercial sex act. Commercial meaning that any sex act is exchanged for something of value. When it comes to child sex trafficking, the definition is actually very similar. However, you don't need any proof or sign of force, fraud, or coercion. So child sex trafficking is the harboring, recruiting, transporting, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a purpose for the purpose of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act in which the person induced to perform such act has not yet attained the age of 18. So I think there's an understanding that children don't need too much of a push to be in a situation where they're being forced to commit commercial sex acts. And one thing I like to say is generally there is no such thing as a child prostitute. For the most part, many children under the age of 18 are being trafficked for commercial sex.
Okay. And one of the most terrifying truths of trafficking, especially with children, is that they are especially at risk because they can essentially be groomed in any setting. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
So could you tell me how we can all recognize that a child is either being groomed or is involved in sex trafficking?
Yes, so some of the same behaviors that we discussed in what you may see for child abuse is also what you will see for children who are being groomed or being trafficked for sex. So you might see the sudden changes in behavior, which may include skipping school, sneaking out of their home, or spending days away from school without any explanation. Oftentimes, especially with trafficking of children, you're going to see them carrying large amounts of cash that they may not have been seen with before, expensive items, new watches, new shoes that are probably out of the range of what someone who's not working, could afford. And you'll also hear them reference things like, oh, I'm going out of state with a friend. And especially if you're a teacher who's been with the student, for several months, and you kind of are familiar with who their friends are and they start naming other people, then
Yeah.
you may not recognize who these friends are. And if you are in a situation where you happen to encounter a child who may be being trafficked, one of the biggest things is that they may not know what state or city they're in because they're being transported across county or state borders pretty often. So that's a big one. And again, with the sudden change of behavior, they may become very private by what they're doing, either on their phones, on their computers, and they also may also have unexplained injuries. So those are some of the ways that you can identify a child who's being abused and or trafficked.
Okay, thanks for sharing those. I know we kind of touched on this a little bit, but specifically and particularly, I do want people to recognize the difference. Could you tell us what is child sex trafficking and how it's different from human trafficking?
Yes. So child sex trafficking is recognized as one of the forms of human trafficking, but one of the understandings is that children don't need to be necessarily forced, coerced, or in the way that adults are, because some of the threats to adulthood, may not apply to children. So if a child is being controlled, even if they think that they're doing it of their own volition, like they want to be there, but someone else is controlling them, we would still call that situation a trafficking situation of a child.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I've heard the term, and I'm sure a lot of people have, of labor trafficking. So is human trafficking different than labor trafficking?
So labor trafficking is also another form another recognized form of human trafficking. And the main difference between labor trafficking and sex trafficking is that labor is recognized as it's recognized as the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjecting a child or an adult to perform labor or services that are not connected to commercial sex acts. So one of the reasons why a lot of people have probably heard of sex and labor trafficking is because the fact that labor trafficking can be a little difficult to recognize, as victims are often found in settings that appear to be completely legitimate and legal, such as in beauty salons, massage parlors, in the entertainment industry as performers. We've seen circus performers who were trafficked as adults. And it's also difficult to recognize labor trafficking in situations in domestic situations like where we have au pairs or nannies.
Okay. So thanks for sharing the different kind of types of trafficking. And I know that you are well versed in this area, and just want to highlight again that you're an attorney that helps with these kind of legal issues. Can you specify what kind of legal issues that are common and that you can help with?
Yeah. So oftentimes when I come into contact with the survivor, they really are in the stage of trying to stabilize their lives and be independent and not run into an issue where they're vulnerable to being trafficked again. So some of the issues that we definitely have to hit hard are securing housing or jobs. And again, that's because of the previous arrests or convictions for activities they were forced to engage in while they were being trafficked. So obtaining those expungements, non-disclosures, can be super key in securing housing and jobs. Mm-hmm. Further, I also see a lot of survivors whose credit is wrecked due to their traffickers' use of their credit. And so a name change, which ultimately results in a new social security number, and therefore kind of like a clean credit, can be very helpful in moving forward. Traffickers will also often steal or destroy identifying documents such as birth certificates, licenses, and passports, and other things that, especially if you're coming in from a different country, a proper visa and a proper passport is going to be key to being able to stay in the country. So and if you're just the person who, a lot of my survivor clients don't have birth certificates, which is a complete bar to obtaining a job or applying for housing without that type of identification. So ID restoration is also very key in obtaining job security. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, awesome. And so do you charge for the legal services that you can provide, like the ones you just talked about?
Mhm. No, so thankfully we are able to provide everything for free through Lone Star Legal Aid, as long as there are certain financial eligibility requirements that are met.
Okay, awesome. And do you work with other community partners when, trying to reach and help victims?
Yes, so as we all know, one person or one organization cannot handle every type of issue out there. So I do significant capacity building work with community partners to provide wraparound services to our clients. And as Lone Star Legal Aid, we're experts in civil legal work. So there are aspects of the lives of survivors that need attention, such as emergency housing, criminal justice issues, health matters, and more that we all look to our community partners to aid with.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all the questions I have for you today. I appreciate you answering those. There's a couple things that I want to highlight again. And again, it's just to make everybody aware of National Crime Victims Week and Child Abuse Awareness, Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Just a big thank you to all of our victim service providers. And just to also let victims know that there are resources available. There's attorneys like Davina that are more than willing to help and are here for any legal services that are needed. And unless there's anything else that you would like to share or highlight, again, I appreciate you being here, answering some of these questions I had, and just bringing awareness to all of these important victim topics.
Yeah, the one last thing I would like to say that I think is really important is to remember that abuse can stem from strangers, but it can also stem from those that we know very well, such as parents, relatives, siblings. And so sometimes we may not realize that someone is in an abusive or a trafficking situation because we assume that they're with their parents. But sometimes parents are the biggest perpetrators of these crimes, unfortunately. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, that's definitely an important thing to recognize. Well, like I said, that's all I have, unless there are questions or anything else. I think that's it. Again, just appreciate your time, and thank you for sharing your knowledge.
Thank you so much for having me, Jocelyn. This is great. Thank you.